and we are back with my own personal rewrite of Game of Thrones. We've gone over season 5 and 6, and now it's time to get into the real meat of what went wrong with this show. And to keep things simple, I'm just gonna go over the rest of the seasons, or at least my version of the seasons, episode by episode like a Wikipedia entry. I'm just gonna be laying out all of the essential information that would happen each week. I'm not gonna go over small things like character interactions or dialogue, which tends to pad out a lot of the episodes. These are just the basic and most crucial plot points that would occur episode by episode. And remember, this is just my version of season 7, and as such, it's gonna follow on from the changes that I made to the previous seasons. So if some of what I say doesn't quite make sense and doesn't match up with some of the stuff that happened in season 7 in the show, it's probably because it's feeding into the stuff that I changed about the last couple of seasons. So go ahead and watch that video first before watching this one. With that being said, let's just go ahead and get straight into this. So my version of season 7 would revolve entirely around the war between Cersei and Daenerys, or the War of Two Queens as I would call it. The first episode would open as it does in the show with Arya killing the Freys and heading on her way to Winterfell. Cersei meanwhile is preparing for her war with Daenerys. She allies herself with Euron Greyjoy and the Tarlys. She then orders them and Jaime to go and conquer Highgarden, which is ruled by Olenna Tyrell, who has thrown in her lot with Daenerys, and also sends a section of her own forces along with them. This serves to show that in this coming war, Cersei is acting a lot more hasty and aggressive in her strategizing than Daenerys, which would make far more sense for her character. Cersei has always been overconfident in her abilities, and given her recent victory over the Tyrells and the Faith Militant in the previous season, she would be more assured in her own blow things up and ask questions later method of warfare. Meanwhile, Jon and Sansa are working together to reconstruct the North after Ramsay Bolton pretty much ran the whole place into the ground. Jon gives the Umbers and the Karstarks back their holdfasts and assigns the Wildlings to guard the wall, much to Sansa and many of the other Northern Lords' disagreement. Here we begin to see a rift form between Sansa's method of ruling and Jon's. Remember, she has been the acting Lady of the Vale for the previous season and has been learning how to play this political Game of Thrones from Littlefinger before she betrayed him. Sansa is approaching this new position that she has as a politician, which makes sense given all the political power that she has accumulated in the North and in the Vale up to this point. While Jon is approaching this as a survivalist, Jon just doesn't have time for politics when he's seen the imminent threats of the White Walkers beyond the wall, but Sansa doesn't quite understand that because she hasn't been there. She hasn't seen the White Walkers, so she's approaching the task of rebuilding the North more from a politician's point of view. However, their negotiations come to an abrupt halt when Bran arrives at Winterfell after his botched training with the Three-Eyed Raven and reunites with Jon and Sansa. He informs them of glimpses that he's had of events going on in the south, so everything to do with Cersei and Daenerys he's gotten a few visions on that he tells his siblings about. Meanwhile, over in Old Town, Samwell Tarly works hard at the Citadel but is spending his free time learning from the library books with Gilly. Ser Jorah is also revealed to be quarantined in one of the grayscale cells, and Sam begins to treat him in secret. And the episode would end pretty much as it did in the show, with Daenerys arriving at Dragonstone. Episode 2. Daenerys and her allies make preparations for war. Tyrion advises a more patient approach to this, taking Westeros piece by piece instead of just using the dragons to wholesale slaughter innocent people. At Tyrion and Melisandre's insistence, Daenerys sends a raven to the north asking Jon Snow to come to Dragonstone and bend the knee, giving them a very powerful ally. However, when her raven arrives, the Northern Lords express their dismay at Daenerys' invitation, Sansa being one of the chief voices among them. But Jon goes anyway with Davos Seaworth, noting that a huge cache of dragonglass exists under Dragonstone, and also noting that Daenerys' dragons would be very helpful in taking out the White Walkers. He then leaves the North in Sansa's care before departing Winterfell. Meanwhile, Cersei has learnt of growing dissent among the people of the capital after the destruction of the Sept of Baelor. Baelor, and this uprising is led by an individual known only as the Bull. We don't know who the Bull is quite yet, but I'm pretty sure you can summarize who it is if you're a fan of the books. At the same time, an emissary from the Iron Bank comes to King's Landing intent on securing the crown's debts. Cersei is unable to pay, of course, but promises that they will soon have their gold once they've secured it from Highgarden once Olenna Tyrell is dead. This is important to note because it shows that Cersei has planted the seeds of her own destruction well before the War of Two Queens began. See, in my opinion, the thing that should have been Cersei's undoing wasn't necessarily her war with Daenerys, but her sheer short-sightedness and casual disregard for matters which she deems to be trivial or inconvenient. We've seen this play out multiple times over the course of the show. Every time she makes a play for power and thinks that she's won, the consequences always come to bite her in the behind. She captures Ned Stark in season 1, which eventually leads to the War of Five Kings and her son's death. She gives power to the High Sparrow and the Faith Militant, which leads to her traumatizing Walk of Atonement. So having the consequences for that short-sightedness lead to her ultimate defeat would make a lot more sense and be more poetic than what we got in the show. Meanwhile, over in Dorne, Doran and Ellaria discuss their future plans for their alliance with Daenerys. Doran explains that while he initially hoped that he could marry his son Trystane to Marcella Baratheon, thereby securing the throne for House Martell, Cersei crowning herself pretty much illegally has ultimately thrown a wrench in his schemes. He suggests an alternative to Ellaria, saying that Trystane would make a perfect match for Daenerys Targaryen instead, thereby cementing an alliance between the two houses. Ellaria, however, notes that Daenerys might not be happy with that arrangement, and this definitely comes into play in the later seasons. Meanwhile, as per Cersei's instructions, a portion of Euron's fleet have arrived at Highgarden, with Euron expecting Daenerys to show up with her dragons and allowing him the chance to use the Dragonhorn in order to take control of them. The combined forces of Tarly, Ironborn, and Lannister sweep through the castle only to find it mysteriously deserted. They then come under a surprise attack from both Dothraki and Dornish soldiers who bottleneck them on the Manda River, which runs alongside Highgarden, thereby trapping them. Euron's flagship and several of his other ships escape whilst the battle ensues, and Daenerys wipes out most of the Ironborn and the Lannister soldiers. The Battle of Highgarden is ultimately won by Daenerys' side, and the Tarlys are captured. And if this strategy sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's basically the same strategy that Jaime and Cersei used to take Highgarden in the show, only it's Tyrion, the smartest character in the whole show, who came up with it instead and is using it against them. Having this change makes more sense from a couple of perspectives. One, it gives Daenerys an early victory in the War of Two Queens by playing off of Cersei's hastiness to win the war. And two, it means that Tyrion is still an intelligent strategist and not an impotent, useless side character like he eventually became in the show. I mean, this is the guy who came up with the whole wildfire strategy to defeat Stannis in season 2. Why not show some of that same cunning in season 7? It makes way more sense for him to come up with this sort of a strategy than Cersei, a woman that her own father described as not being as smart as she thinks that she is. Episode 3. Cersei expresses her fury over the loss at Highgarden, as well as news that the Iron Bank have now taken to supporting Daenerys' cause in response to Cersei failing to pay them back. Jaime watches Cersei become increasingly more and more cruel and deranged, sending soldiers to brutally punish the dissenters in King's Landing. Word then reaches the people of the capital of Daenerys' approach, creating further tension among the populace. While some of the rebels are concerned and afraid, their leader, the Bull, advises them to not trouble themselves over the wars of rulers who do not care for them. And this is when we get the big reveal that the Bull is actually Gendry. He rallies the people of King's Landing together and encourages them to fight back against the Lannister soldiers. He's essentially sowing the seeds of rebellion here. Meanwhile, the Tarlys, after their heinous defeat at Highgarden, are brought before Daenerys, and she has them executed by Dragonfire after they refuse to bend the knee. This is us getting another sign of Daenerys' ruthlessness here. Remember, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that she started to go evil in the show. I just feel like it could have been executed better, and this is a good example of how to do it right. Having secured Highgarden and the Reach, Tyrion suggests that their next target be the Riverlands and the Westerlands, and Daenerys readies her forces accordingly. Remember, Tyrion is advising Daenerys to do this slowly, patiently, take the kingdom piece by piece instead of all at once. Meanwhile, Sam begins his treatment of Ser Jorah's grayscale at the Citadel, and at his insistence tries every cure ever suspected of curing the affliction without knowing which one will actually be correct. Meanwhile, Jon arrives at Dragonstone, and Daenerys demands that he bends the knee, but he refuses, stating that while he doesn't really care who gets to sit on the Iron Throne, the North can't afford to submit to Southern rulers after all that it has suffered. He also makes his case that the White Walkers constitute a far greater threat to the North and the realm than Cersei does. Whilst Daenerys is skeptical about the existence of the White Walkers, Tyrion successfully brokers a deal between them. Jon agrees to pledge soldiers to Daenerys' cause and fight on her behalf, and in exchange she will help them deal with the White Walker threat and grant the North independence, but only after the War of Two Queens is won. Back in the north, Arya arrives at Winterfell and reunites with Sansa and Bran. Bran gives them snippets of what's going on with Jon, but none of them are willing to act until Jon sends orders. Remember, in my version of the show, Bran isn't totally omniscient. He can't see everything, everywhere, everywhen perfectly. And as a result of that, none of them are really willing to act on his visions until they get word from Jon. Soon afterwards, the Brotherhood Without Banners arrives at Winterfell, with the Hound being among one of their number, and he and Arya get their nice little reunion. Episode 4. A raven arrives from Dragonstone confirming what the Starks had suspected. Jon commands the armies of the North to mobilize in order to aid Daenerys in the War of Two Queens. Sansa and many of the Northern Lords are reluctant to participate, wanting instead to rest and recuperate after defeating the Boltons, whilst Arya and several others are eager to get revenge on Cersei, and rightfully so. Sansa eventually agrees to send a portion of the Northern forces, specifically the armies of Umber and Karstark, while keeping a contingent behind in order to help the North rebuild. She also manipulates the Lords of the Vale into sending their own forces into the war. This is showing the scale of Sansa's political cunning. She's using noble houses she doesn't trust and armies that aren't actual Northerners in order to minimize the risk to her own people. Annoyed by her sister's political scheming and apparent cowardice, Arya goes with the Northern forces in order to help Jon fight Cersei. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood Without Banners are refusing to take part in the battle, seeing the war with the White Walkers as being more important than the War of Two Queens. The Hound, on the other hand, disagrees, breaks off with them, and goes along with Arya. Ser Jorah's grayscale is cured from Sam's efforts, though he is unsure what method that he used was actually the successful one. Jorah departs Oldtown in order to head to Dragonstone and reunite with Daenerys. Sam implores the Archmaesters to research ways of stopping the White Walkers, but they remain completely unmoved, not believing the Walkers to be a serious threat, and Sam ends up venting his frustrations out on Gilly that ends up putting a strain on their relationship. Meanwhile, Tyrion devises a new plan to ensure Cersei's defeat. He advises Daenerys to send her unsullied army across the Riverlands, conquering and liberating the surrounding territory as they go. Meanwhile, the armies of Dorne move from their position at Highgarden into the Stormlands, securing the area on behalf of Daenerys Targaryen and dealing with the Lannister forces stationed there and around the Kingswood nearby King's Landing, essentially setting the stage for Daenerys' arrival. Once they near Riverrun, Daenerys' army would meet with the approaching Northern army, and together they would march towards the Westerlands. Then, once they near Casterly Rock, the armies of the Reach would approach from the south to converge on the seat of House Lannister's power. Remember, nobody else in the show knows that the Casterly Rock mines are dry as a bone, and Casterly Rock is essentially worthless. Only Jaime and Cersei know that they have no gold left. The upshot of Tyrion's plan is that the castle would fall in a day, Cersei would be left with little to no power, and they could then march straight into King's Landing to overthrow the Queen. Yeah, this is all gonna turn out great, don't you just know it? Daenerys then consents to the plan and places Grey Worm and Jon Snow in joint command of her forces, intending to stay in Dragonstone until the Riverlands are secure. However, Yara Greyjoy, one of Daenerys' main allies here, comments on her restraint, saying that she should simply take her dragons and burn Casterly Rock shot to the ground without wasting any time. She also voices her impatience on Daenerys' apparent inaction on overthrowing Euron Greyjoy. Daenerys, however, assures Yara that she has a plan for taking the Iron Islands and she needn't worry. In the Red Keep, meanwhile, Qyburn shows Cersei his latest advancement, a catapult designed to bring down a dragon should Euron's Dragonhorn fail to control them. Cersei also sends the Mountain onto the streets of King's Landing in order to silence the rebels. He kills several overzealous members of the population, which Gendry first-hand witnesses, and instead of deterring him, this only spurs him into further action. Episode 5, Daenerys' conquest of the Riverlands begins in earnest. The Unsullied quickly overcome the meager Lannister forces stationed near and around Harrenhal as they make their way towards Riverrun, which remains ungoverned as the Freys have now all been killed. Thanks, Arya. The Northern Army, meanwhile, moves down towards the Riverlands and cross the Twins, heading towards Riverrun. You can maybe have a few bits of dialogue here between Arya and the Hound, you know, them connecting a little bit more, just seeing how far each other have come. Meanwhile, Cersei orders Euron to sail to Casterly Rock with the remainder of his fleet in order to prepare the defenses for Daenerys' arrival. She gives them possession of some secret weapon, which will be instrumental in defeating Daenerys' forces, but she doesn't tell Jaime what it is. The divide between the two twins is starting to grow even wider by this point, and this is setting up something that's going to happen later on in the season. Meanwhile, up in the north, Sansa continues to govern the people, whilst Bran spends most of his time in the Godswood developing and honing his abilities as a Greenseer. During a session that he spends in the past, he learns that Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark were in love and wed in secret, leading to Robert's rebellion and the birth of a child, the true-born ruler of Westeros, which Bran deduces to be Jon Snow. He tells Sansa of this, and she starts to see it as an opportunity to supplant power from Daenerys if she reneges on her promise to free the North. Back in the Riverlands, the northern forces come close to meeting Daenerys' army, but come under a sudden attack from Euron's fleet, which lies moored in Iron Man's Bay. They use catapults given to them by Cersei, and their attack levels the Northerners, who are forced to retreat further inland. Grey Worm and Jon, meanwhile, come under attack from Lannister forces that were sent from the Westerlands to defend the area. They're able to beat the forces back, but are unable to reach Riverrun, and the castle is now under Lannister control. Episode 6. Daenerys receives word of the danger and is prompted by Yara to go with her dragons in order to aid them. Tyrion advises against the plan, saying that it's precisely what Euron and Cersei are waiting for. Daenerys, however, sides with Yara and tells her to sail up the Trident in order to meet her at Riverrun, while she goes on ahead with her dragons to deal with the threat. Much to his annoyance, Tyrion is ordered to accompany Yara and Theon on their mission. Daenerys first arrives at Riverrun and she uses her dragons to destroy the Lannister forces surrounding the castle. She then rides Drogon atop the battlements and threatens to destroy the entire holdfast unless the soldiers surrender. Terrified, they throw down their weapons and Riverrun is theirs. Although he's thankful, Jon questions whether or not she would have actually made good on her promise and destroyed the castle of Riverrun. Rather ominously, she does not answer. This is yet another sign of Daenerys' slow descent into madness. Meanwhile, she orders her forces to remain at Riverrun as she and Jon fly on Drogon's back in order to aid the Northerners that are stranded by Euron's attack. The Ironborn have docked on the shores of Iron Man's Bay and are beginning to move further inland. However, Daenerys and Jon arrive to save the day, and Drogon immediately attacks the Ironborn fleet. Jon takes command of his own forces, and together they push back the Greyjoy army into Iron Man's Bay. Euron flees on his flagship back to the Iron Islands, and Daenerys pursues, out for blood this time. Once at his home, Euron attempts to use the Dragonhorn, convinced that it'll allow him to take control of the dragons for himself. Daenerys arrives, Euron is there, he tries to use the Dragonhorn, convinced that it will let him control the dragons, and it doesn't work. Turns out it was just an ugly horn, there was no magic behind it at all, and he and Cersei were wasting their time on it. He is of course burned alive, and the Battle of Iron Man's Bay, as it will now henceforth be called, is won by Daenerys, and the Iron Islands come under her and Yara Greyjoy's control. Episode 7. Yara thanks Daenerys for securing the Iron Islands for her and pledges the loyalty of the Ironborn to House Targaryen in perpetuity. On top of the Iron Islands, however, Daenerys also gives Yara command command of Riverrun, much to the chagrin of several of her supporters who see Edmure Tully as the rightful heir. Daenerys makes her case that Edmure has demonstrated his incompetence more than once, making mention of the fact that if he was actually good at running Riverrun, then it wouldn't have fallen under the Lannisters' control in the first place. She states that incompetence is not rewarded with castles, loyalty is, and henceforth Yara Greyjoy is made the joint queen of the Iron Islands, the ruler of Pike, and the ruler of Riverrun and warden of the Riverlands. Despite their anger, the River Lords obey Daenerys' orders to join in their war more out of fear than anything else. They're not at all happy with the idea of Yara Greyjoy being in charge of Riverrun, but once they see Daenerys' dragons, they quickly fall into line. The men of the Riverlands are then sent with Yara's fleet along the Trident with orders to rid the Riverlands of any remaining Lannister forces. Jon's army joins with Daenerys's, and Jon also reunites with Arya. Now the combined forces of Northmen, Unsullied, and Ironborn march towards Castle Rock in order to meet the armies of the Reach and seize Cersei's only other refuge. However, when they are on the road, Ser Jorah meets Daenerys' armies as they are travelling, and Daenerys ultimately forgives him for his betrayal. Cersei is informed of Euron's demise and commands all of her forces to retreat into King's Landing, sealing off the city behind them. Jaime questions her actions on this and begins to realize that Cersei has absolutely no intention of giving up the Iron Throne one way or another. She declares martial law over the capital city, setting curfews and arresting citizens in the streets for crimes as minor as expressing incendiary views against the Queen. This is where tensions start to reach their bursting point in King's Landing. Daenerys and Jon's forces arrive at Lannisport and sweep through the city, killing any remnants of Cersei's forces along the way. As Grey Worm leads the Unsullied into Castle Rock, they find the place to be barely guarded, and as they push further into the castle, they trigger a trap that was laid by Euron's forces prior to his defeat. A huge cache of wildfire hidden within the bounds of the Holdfast, as well as the mines running underneath Lannisport. The entire castle, as well as much of the city, is engulfed in flame. Much of Jon and Daenerys' army is decimated, Grey Worm and half the Unsullied are killed, the army of the Vale is also wiped out, many of the Northmen pillaging Lannisport at the time were likewise taken by the explosion, a huge chunk of the civilian population are killed, and Tyrion has also just watched his hometown, like his childhood home, getting destroyed by his own sister. This is the first major loss suffered by Daenerys and Jon in this war. It's the first major blow that they've been dealt. Episode 8. Daenerys and Jon's forces attempt to recover from the blow that was dealt by Cersei. Tyrion expresses guilt on not being able to see just how far off the deep end she has gone during the War of Two Queens. Jaime, meanwhile, is feeling very much the same way that Tyrion is feeling. He berates Cersei's actions, calling her evil and dangerous, but then, because the Queen was threatened, the Mountain picks him up by the neck in her defense, and she eventually orders him to release him on the condition that Jaime falls back into line. This is the point when Jaime realizes that he has become Cersei's slave. He's trapped. He's powerless against her now. There's nothing he can do to go against her will. He could try and run away, but ultimately if he tries to join forces with the Northerners, he's just gonna get executed. So really, he's trapped in a box. Meanwhile, Jon and Daenerys then turn their sights on King's Landing and begin marching towards their destination. Despite Tyrion's shock at the scale of Cersei's ruthlessness, he advises Daenerys to keep a level head as they don't want to go falling into any more traps. But having reached the end of her tether, Daenerys takes Rogon ahead of Jon's army, destroying most of the Westerlands in the process as she hunts down the remaining Lannister forces that are occupying the region. She has become increasingly more brutal against her enemies by this point. At this stage, she is about to pass the point of no return. Meanwhile, in the north, Bran informs Sansa of the events at Castle Rock, and she begins to doubt Jon's effectiveness as a ruler. She calls together a council of the Northern Lords to discuss possible actions to take in light of the recent tragedy, and the meeting quickly turns sour as the Lords are divided between those loyal to Jon and those who consider him unfit to lead. Hearing news of the escalation of the War of Two Queens, Sam becomes frustrated with the Grand Maester's refusal to accept the dangers of the White Walkers and then proceeds to leave the Citadel. He expects Gilly to come with him, but she ends up refusing, stating that she's finally found peace in Old Town with her son. son, and that Sam has stirred a love for knowledge and learning in her that she never knew she even had. She tells Sam that she wants to stay in Old Town to raise her son, and though he is upset, Sam does understand her point and her desire and says goodbye to her, promising to come back once the White Walkers are defeated. Meanwhile, in Castle Black, a raven arrives stating that more rangers are going missing beyond the wall and cold winds are fast approaching. The White Walkers have almost arrived. Episode 9. Events begin escalating in King's Landing. The Lannister forces are pushed back by the rebels led by Gendry into the innermost regions of the city. Gendry and his forces are also preparing for Daenerys' imminent arrival. The combined armies of the North, Dorne, the Vale, the Reach, and the Unsullied and the Dothraki approach the gates of King's Landing. Cersei emerges from her hiding in the Red Keep, and Tyrion breaks ranks from Daenerys' side and pleads with her to surrender the city and prevent further bloodshed. Cersei's only response to this is her fabled,
"I choose violence."
She then calls fire to one of her soldiers on the battlement, and they let loose a hidden bolt from a scorpion, one of the ones that Qyburn made, which ends up impaling Rhaegar. It dies soon after, and a grief-stricken Daenerys orders the combined armies to attack the city. Cersei retreats from the battlements as her soldiers fire scorpions and catapults at the invading army. She encounters heavy resistance from within the city, however, as the citizens revolt in full, swarming through the streets and instigating a city-wide riot with Gendry leading them. Daenerys, meanwhile, mad with rage, mounts on Drogon and flies him and Viserion over the battlements. The dragons take several lances to the body, but none of them deadly, and they end up burning through the defenses within minutes. Her army and Jon's army swarm through the city, allying themselves with the rebels against the Lannister forces. Tyrion watches the battle unfold from afar and realizes the trap that they fall into, the same trap that they did at Casterly Rock, and though he tried to warn Daenerys beforehand, it's too late. As the carnage ensues, Cersei and Jaime arrive back at the Red Keep, but the people are right outside their door baying for blood. The Mountain and the Queen's Guard are then sent into the city to try and deal with the rebels in a last futile effort to keep the Queen safe. Arya and the Hound are among Jon's forces, and they end up fighting the Lannister men together and eventually find Gendry in the middle of the fray. They have a very brief reunion before the fight continues, and they then encounter the Mountain slaughtering the rebels pretty much single-handedly. The three of them, Arya, the Hound, and Gendry, then team up together and manage to finally kill the Mountain. But of course, they're not able to properly defeat him before the Hound sacrifices himself to save Arya's life. Meanwhile, Cersei and Jaime retreat into the throne room of the Red Keep, and Cersei calls for the Pyromancer. Daenerys is right outside, taking her dragons up to the Red Keep and begins to destroy the castle in a blind rage. Cersei then gives the order to the Pyromancer to light the caches of wildfire that are stashed around the city. And of course, she tells the Pyromancer that classic old line, "Count them all!" We could have a little flashback with Jaime remembering what the Mad King had said, and he realizes what has to be done. He basically sees this whole thing playing out and goes, "Oh, damn it, I'm gonna have to do this again, aren't I?" He takes his sword, kills the Pyromancer before turning the blade on his own sister. She dies in his arms, and mad with grief, Jaime slits his throat with the same sword that he killed Cersei with and sits on the Iron Throne, bleeding to death with Cersei in his arms. Episode 10. Daenerys declares victory in the War of Two Queens and proclaims the end of Cersei Lannister's tyranny to the people of King's Landing. Tyrion, meanwhile, enters the throne room in the Red Keep and finds the bodies of his siblings there at the Iron Throne. Daenerys arrives and commands the body of her father's killer to be removed from her throne. She then sits atop the Iron Throne, relishing the power that she has at her command, as snow begins to fall over the hall, a sign that winter has now well and truly fallen over Westeros. Meanwhile, over in the north, Bran informs Sansa of Jon and Daenerys' victory, reassuring her that Arya is alive. Sansa expresses worry over Daenerys' means of winning the war, further deepening her suspicions that she won't make good on her promise to free the north. Back in King's Landing, Daenerys begins making plans for her rule, commanding the Lords of Westeros to pledge fealty to her immediately. Jon questions this, stating that they had an agreement to free the North once the war was won, but Daenerys confirms her power-hungry nature by refusing to grant the request, stating that only a united realm can hope to stand future threats such as Cersei or the coming White Walkers. By this point, Jon realizes the trap that he's fallen into. He can't go against Daenerys or fight for the North's independence because her dragons are the only genuine weapon they have against the coming threat. He can't risk pissing the new queen off because if he does, she would simply refuse to travel north, and by the time the White Walkers breach the wall, it'll be too late. He has no choice but to obey Daenerys' wishes to keep the North as part of the Seven Kingdoms. This is the point when Daenerys' ambition and ego override her desire to help the realm, and it's only gonna get worse in the next season. Daenerys believes that her will is integral to the safety and security of the Seven Kingdoms, and that if left unchecked, rulers like Robert, Joffrey, and Cersei will be allowed to flourish every single time. This is how you show the rise of a dictator. You see their good intentions and the justifications that they have in their own heads, but you also see just how full of shit they are. The Lords of Westeros gather in the ruins of the throne room and pledge an uneasy alliance to Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name Queen of the Andals and the First Men, rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. Meanwhile, over in the north, the White Walkers are coming in sight of the wall, indicating that they have pretty much arrived. And that's where Season 7 comes to an end. So yeah, that's my rewrite of Season 7. It took me a lot longer to write this than I thought that it would, but I'm glad that I was finally able to finish it. In the meantime, let me know what you thought of my rewrite in the comments down below, if there's anything that you would change, anything that you would add, any other updates that you might have thought of watching this season. And if you want to see more of my videos, you can go check out my Patreon. I recently set it up, I'm still figuring out some of the kinks, but if you want to contribute, if you want to sign onto it, if you want to donate, that would be utterly amazing of you. I'm trying to work in ways that once I reach a certain number of patrons, they'll be able to contribute to the videos that I do next. So if you want to be a part of that, go ahead over to my Patreon, and as always, hit the like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.